Hello and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Latifa, your go-to guide to understanding today's China and its role in the world. I'm happy to have you with us today and grateful that you always make time to watch us. We have a packed show today which will start with China Currents as usual, and then later the Thinkers Forum where our scholars are on standby to digest all the issues involving China and its relations with the rest of the world. Interestingly, we have about 4 different guests for today's segment of the Thinkers Forum. So let's begin with China Currents, your weekly news report on what's happening in China with our host, Derek. This week, the spotlight shifts to Washington, where Joe Biden has finally left the White House, but his retirement comes with a twist. He's left a farewell gift, a lethal trap for his successor, Donald Trump. On the surface, it looks like a tough new crackdown on Chinese chip manufacturing. But is there more to it than what meets the eye? Let's dive into it.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on what's happening in China. I'm Derek. Joe Biden has finally left the White House, but before his retirement, he left a farewell gift, a lethal trap for his successor, Donald Trump. On the surface, it appears to be a new crackdown on Chinese chip manufacturing. In reality, it includes 2 bombs Biden has tied to America's economy and diplomacy. The first bomb, which began its countdown in Biden's final months in office, could cripple the U.S. manufacturing sector, which heavily relies on chips. On 23rd of December last year, the Office of the United States Trade Representative launched a Section 301 investigation into what it called overcapacity in China's chip exports. Notably, this investigation took place after the outcome had effectively been predetermined. This is because 3 months earlier, the USTR had already announced plans to double tariffs on Chinese chips in 2025. Therefore, the investigation has little impact on China. However, this investigation now passed on to the Trump administration could deal a heavy blow to American manufacturing. While the US can produce cutting-edge 5nm chips, a 2022 Commerce Department survey found that what US manufacturers lack most are chips produced using mature processes, which are about 40nm. And in this area, the US is highly reliant on Chinese exports. According to the Bureau of Industry and Security, more than 2/3 of American products may contain chips made in China. Among surveyed manufacturers, 72% said Chinese suppliers offer lower prices and are difficult to replace. For example, microcontroller chips, a common type of a mature process chip, are found in everything from electric toothbrushes to vehicles and industrial robots. While China, the US, and Europe all produce MCUs, Chinese chips cost as little as $1 compared to at least $5 for their American or European counterparts. Slapping tariffs on irreplaceable Chinese chips will only raise costs for American suppliers, further eroding the competitiveness of US manufacturing. For Trump and Elon Musk, who are championing the return of manufacturing to the US, this is anything but good news. The second bomb, set off just 10 days before Biden's departure, directly threatens America's leading industry, artificial intelligence. On 9th of January, Biden proposed stricter restrictions on NVIDIA's chip exports to China, aiming to curb the development of Chinese AI technologies. To China, the policy seems almost laughable. This is because just a month earlier, on 10th of December last year, China had launched an antitrust investigation into NVIDIA, causing this American tech giant's stock to plummet, wiping out $100 billion in market value overnight. China's antitrust move sent a clear signal. It no longer depends on the US for advanced GPU chips. Years of innovation have enabled China's semiconductor industry to overcome its shortcomings and challenge US dominance in advanced chips. By 2024, China's domestically produced DUV lithography machines had achieved 8 nanometer overlay precision, sufficient to manufacture GPU chips capable of competing with NVIDIA. Meanwhile, Chinese firms such as Threads and the China Telecom developed the tools for AI training and advanced networking technologies. For Chinese tech companies, NVIDIA has become replaceable. Even NVIDIA itself opposed Biden's proposal, warning that further restrictions on exports to China would threaten economic growth and America's leadership. However, Washington's political elite seems deaf to such warnings. Instead, they are leveraging the China threat narrative to pressure allies in the Arab world. In a letter to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, Representatives John Munanar and Raja Krishnamurthy from the House Committee on the Chinese Communist Party expressed concerns over China's ties with the United Arab Emirates. They argued that any country using Huawei's cloud computing equipment should face restrictions and claimed that US AI technology offers an opportunity to pry both companies and countries out of Beijing's orbit. What Munanar may not realize is that Huawei's data centers are the key supplier for Converge ICT Solutions, a Philippine telecom company that serves 54% of Filipino households. Would the US restrict its most critical military ally in the region as well? This conundrum created by Biden's policy is now Trump's problem to solve. By imposing these two sanctions on Chinese chips, Biden has effectively double-checked his successor. If Trump maintains the sanctions, American manufacturing will collapse. If he revokes them, he risks being branded a coward who surrendered to China, taking the blame for Biden's failure in the chip war. On the other hand, regardless of Trump's next move, over half of US manufacturing has already been abandoned to a wholly unnecessary supply chain crisis. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please reach us at the email address below. We look forward to hearing from you. See you next time.
And next up on China Now, we bring you the Thinkers Forum, a deep dive into the perspectives shaping the world's understanding of China. This week, we are joined by Ron Unz, American theoretical physicist, a publisher and founder of the Unz Review. He shares his thought-provoking analysis on how the neocons and certain American geostrategies have, in their attempt to contain China, inadvertently undercut America's own position. Future historians, he suggests, may see these actions as some of the most irrational geopolitical strategies of modern history, a move that defied logic and cost America its long-term influence. Let's hear his insights.
The neocons really dominated American foreign policy for more than 30 years, are a very irrationally aggressive group. In other words, they're not realists. They're not rationalists. I mean, in other words, basically, the wars that have fought in the Middle East have cost America a gigantic amount of money. I mean, $7 trillion. They've destroyed so much of the Middle East. America is now fighting a proxy war against Russia on Russia's own border. America basically has been providing the weapons to kill Russians, the missiles that are being fired into Russia. And so I think part of it is the neocons are a much less rational group than most countries have running, their foreign policy. The notion of America overthrowing in a coup d'etat the neutralist government in Ukraine and then talking about positioning missiles, potentially first strike missiles and anti-missile defenses, right on the Russian border was utterly rational. I mean, there's also, all of this evidence that the Russians claim to have gathered that America was putting biolabs, biological warfare labs on the Russian border. Preparing potentially biological attacks against Russia. In other words, steps like that are so irrationally aggressive that they really can lead to very counterproductive policies. Now, to give the neocons their due, they wrongly assumed that Russia and Ukraine and Putin's regime were far weaker than they were. In other words, they felt if they could lure Russia, if they could provoke Russia into invading Ukraine, the economic sanctions they then would deploy would destroy the Russian economy. And by destroying the Russian economy, they would cause the collapse of Putin's regime and his replacement by somebody who would be much more really almost of an American puppet. But it didn't work. In other words, Russia's economy has done very well. So, what we've ended up seeing is that the Russian economy has shown that it can outproduce in military production all of NATO and America combined. In other words, you've seen basically that the West is running out of military supplies. They're running out of tank shells. They're running out of tanks. They're running out of armored vehicles. While Russia, on the other hand, has been able to outproduce an unlimited amount of these. So, basically, the Russians have shown that they're much stronger industrially in many ways than the hollowed out West is. And they've certainly shown that they've suffered not at all domestically in their economy because of the sanctions. And in fact, if anything, it's allowed the Russians to gain a much tighter control of their own economy because so many of the American corporations that had bought into Russia during the 1990s ended up then deliberately leaving, ending their operations because of the Western sanctions against Russia. So the Russians were able to replace them, buy their existing stranded assets at very good prices, and basically replace them with domestic products. While, importing, for example, a lot of consumer goods from China and from other countries around the world, and still selling their natural resources, their oil, their gas to Western countries, sometimes via third parties. So in other words, Russia has shown that they're so much stronger economically than the neocons or the rest of the West assume. In fact, it was the West that suffered economically because of inflation and other problems brought about by the cutoff of trade with Russia. So, the result really was a disaster for the neocon geopolitical strategy, even before BRICS and the Russia-China coalition really became as powerful as they have been. In other words, the whole thing about it is, if you look at someone like John Mearsheimer, a very strong realist in geopolitics, he basically advocates taking steps to maintain American dominance around the world geopolitically. And obviously, one of them is to create a balancing coalition to block China. And yet what America did was the exact opposite of that. In other words, America basically became extraordinarily hostile towards Russia. Something like that makes absolutely no logical sense from the point of view of geopolitical realism of the sort practiced by John Mearsheimer. In fact, I ended up writing an article about that earlier this year. The question is why we basically took such a hostile line towards Russia. And the answer to that is the irrational views of the neocons in the United States, who've been very hostile to Russia for decades, but also overemphasized America's power and underemphasized the strength of Russia. So, they really believed that they could overthrow Russia. They could overthrow Putin and establish Russia into a vassal state, into almost a puppet of the American government, much the way it had been in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin. And instead, they pushed Russia away from the United States. They made Russia so hostile to the United States, it naturally formed a very strong alliance with China over the last decade. Since we overthrew the Ukrainian government in 2014, we've naturally pushed Russia into China's arms. And the combination of Russia and China together is so incredibly strong that it really obviates the chance of America being able to successfully oppose it. And so, because basically you have a natural coalition of interests between Russia and China. China has the world's greatest industrial base, has tremendously strong consumer technologies. Russia has very strong advanced military technologies that they've shown with the hypersonic weapons. And it's the greatest set, it contains the greatest storehouse of natural resources in the world. In other words, it can provide all of the natural resources in many areas that an industrial power like China needs. And it's adjacent to China. And by Russia and China working together, they to some extent have brought India into that coalition and other countries as well with the BRICS alliance. And also with the two of them working together, that's caused many of the Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia to recognize the growing power of the BRICS and to shift in that direction. And so with Iran, with Saudi Arabia and many of those countries now shifting in that direction. With BRICS, we're talking about something, a coalition of states that possesses more than half of the world's population, far larger combined economy than the G7. And it's simply too strong a group for for America to successfully face. So, the whole thing about it is we've alienated so many countries around the world. We've alienated Russia, we've alienated China. I mean, we've alienated, for example, India to some extent, many of these Middle Eastern countries. I mean, we might be on the point of starting another war in the Middle East against Iran. So, in a sense, what the neocons and some of the American geostrategists have done is really to undercut any chance of America holding China at bay or successfully sort of containing China, which had been their goal. In other words, future historians may look at what they did as one of the most irrational geopolitical strategies that any country has adopted in many, many centuries. I mean, it made absolutely no sense. So, I mean, on the geopolitical level, we've done so many irrational things. And now with our economy potentially so fragile, I think we're in a very vulnerable position. I think, the Western alliance led by the United States is in a very difficult position, especially because our leadership failed to recognize those difficulties. For example, what's happened in Germany, what's happened in France. I mean, in France, the left-wing and right-wing parties, both of which are much more pro-Russian than the Macron's party. I mean, they ended up winning the last election. And Macron is refusing to give them control of the government, even though they won the election. In Romania, for example, a pro-Russian candidate was on the verge of winning the presidential election, and the government canceled the election. I mean, something like that has never happened before. In other words, the wrong person was going to win, and so you cancel the election. I mean, that's not what a democratic system does. In Germany, again, there's been a complete collapse in support for the mainstream parties that are pro-American, and a tremendous rise in support for parties that were on the political fringe that are much more supportive of Russia on these points. I mean, America destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines, which were the most important European energy infrastructure. I mean, they basically supplied natural gas, supplied cheap energy to Germany and much of the rest of Europe. We destroyed it. It was the largest act of industrial terrorism in the history of the world. Everybody knows that America did it. But since America dominates the global media, the Western media, both in the United States and the rest of the world, very few Germans, very few Europeans, very few Americans are aware that we did it. I mean, media control is one of America's greatest, most potent geopolitical assets, and it can't be denigrate. It's a very, very powerful tool. But at some point, reality does win. And the problem with media propaganda is many times then the people running your government believe their own propaganda. And that's, I think, the reason America provoked Russia in the way it did, why America has been taking all these irrational actions. Because the American government and its leadership believes their own propaganda. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in.
Very interesting insights. Let's now move on to the next part of the Thinkers Forum for another fascinating perspective and topic. Joining us is Keyu Jin, a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Jin will delve into the complexities of the Chinese economy, offering insights into its unique growth model, global impact, and the challenges it faces in a radically changing world. Let's hear what she has to say about the forces driving China's economic future.
Now, if we look at the Chinese economy, don't call it peak China. Don't call it game over because you see a recession. Actually, the U.S. had 12 recessions in the last 100 years. And this is natural. And these natural booms and cycles is not a bad thing because they do weed out the least productive firms and they create space and resources for new firms. That's the creative destruction aspect of the market economy that one should embrace. It is also learning, right, for an economy. It's like the stock market where I argue that paternalism is seemingly on the surface trying to protect retail consumers, but in the end, if you protect them too much, they never learn. And you need to learn. You need to learn from the mistakes. You need to learn how information translates into actions. You need to absorb that knowledge and information and put it into more efficient outcomes and prevent these mistakes being made over. One can argue that after 2015 there was a recession, but to a certain extent kind of stopped or stalled by the Chinese government. And again, rather than waiting for all this to blow up in some major way, but having some small cycles in between is less costly than an explosive outcome over, after a long stretched period of time. So my argument was that these are natural cycles. But if you don't deal with the cyclical problems in the economy with the right tools and with a sufficient commitment, then they become longer term problems and they can become structural problems. And that's what you need to prevent. I think this time around, it started with a lot of the demand side, aggregate demand deficit problems, huge cyclical challenges. But if it's not properly dealt with, they will become longer term economic challenges for China. I think people tend to overlook one important fact in China, which is the real estate is not just the property sector that accounts for broadly 30% of GDP. One of the deeper structural issues about the real estate sector is that it is a quasi-financial system and a shadow fiscal system. And that is a very unique property to China, unlike in the US or unlike in Japan even. So I think there's really very little comparison here because a financial system, well, these real estate companies were generating credit. They were creating liquidity, credit mismatches, and they acted like financial systems. On top of that, the local governments were using land and real estate as either collateral to get more financing, or they depended on revenues from land sources to fund their local projects. So they were tightly linked. The property sector embodied something that's much larger than just the property sector itself. So when it came into trouble or the bubble was, let's say, deflated, then it really also brought down two very important pillars. That's why it's creating liquidity problems in the system, but it's also putting a huge amount of strain on local governments. Local governments have very little resources now to do what we were talking about in terms of the political economy, mayor economy model, and they have a debt overhang. And that eventually also at the same time affects demand on the consumer side because most of their wealth is tied to real estate. And so that really is the reason, I believe, fundamental reason why we're seeing such sluggish growth in China today. Now, part of the high saving rate, which is something that everyone wants to solve the mystery of in China, is related to real estate, where you want to save to purchase a property that is very, very difficult to afford. But it's probably only part of the reason. I think the growing inequality also can explain some of the rise in saving rate, but also the lack of financial channel diversification, right? Away from just real estate as a saving vehicle. There are not many great instruments that you can invest in China to give you a realized return with adjusted risk that is palatable for the Chinese households. If you look at the older generations, everything they did was about saving. They could have meat maybe once a week, once a month, and the days when they were growing up. And what are you going to do? You're not going to be so profligate. You're going to be saving for a rainy day. And so the whole mentality of the Chinese consumers have to shift to break free from that doom is coming and we have to prepare for that to we see our salaries rising, let's spend ahead of the incoming salary and borrow against our future rising income. I think if we're looking at the generational shifts in China, they are very significant, actually radical changes. The younger generation loves a good lifestyle. They have created a much better work-life balance, and so they're much less prone to be working these long hours and multiple shifts that the previous generations opted for in order to earn that extra few dollars. They love to have a good time. They love to spend. They love to borrow. I mean, these are sea change. This is a sea change of mentality. So in that sense, I think that you do need to give a country a certain amount of time, right, to transition, to break free from that previous mentality. The things that are discussed in the nation right now are mostly about which economic policies, how much stimulus, when they're coming, right? There is a notable return to practical economic policies that work. Again, China's not fixated on one path of policies. And as we mentioned before, if it's not the right path, they will turn around. And hence you have seen that in the past, the turns or the pendulum swings of different policies. So I wouldn't be so fixated on one set of ideas, because if they're not good for the economy in the end and there's unemployment problems and this and that, they will change course. And I've been arguing that in the past few years, that there will be a return of pragmatism or a renewed focus on the economic priorities. So I think the view about China has to be, first of all, coming from doing some real homework, right? If investors are interested in China, first of all, over what horizon? If it's over a longer term horizon, then one has to do the homework, look at the companies, look at the micro situation, look at the macro stability factors. If you compare China to lots of other emerging markets, which seem to be gleaming with lots of opportunities, there are still many, many more advantages that China has to offer. So I think that people who have a longer term view about China and who does do the homework to look at the operational, strategic, financial conditions of many of these Chinese companies, they still believe that there are substantial opportunities, especially at today's valuation for these companies. I think that everything driven by perception is not only just not helpful, but also setting a very low standard. And global capital, I still believe, by and large, or at least a large part of the global capital, is non-political. It is about diversifying risk and reaping proper returns. And China is the second largest economy in the world and is offering diversification objectives, if not more than that. And so global capital, after a while, if the Chinese economy can really rebound, I think that they will come back. Not all of it, but enough to both satisfy the Chinese demands for finance, but also the global investors' pursuit of diversified returns.
Right, thank you so much, Prof. That was really insightful, and I hope you enjoyed listening to the wealth of knowledge that Keyu Jin has just shared. Moving on, we hear from Radhika Desai, also a professor in the Department of Political Studies and the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba, Canada. Professor Desai shares her perspective on how, since President Biden's election in 2020, the Western world has united under his leadership to target nations like Russia and China. She explores the implications of this collective commitment and what it reveals about the evolving global order. Please stay with us.
What we saw since the election of President Biden is the commitment of the Western world as a whole. And President Biden seemed to manage to convince all the existing governments in Western capitals to follow his lead in targeting Russia, China, etc. In fact, doing so even more than Trump had done, doing so with greater vigor, greater commitment than Trump had done. He started a war with Russia. I think it was definitely a provoked intervention, provoked war, if nothing else. And of course, with China, he constantly ratcheted up the tension. Whole series of things: the small yard, high wall, export restrictions, the balloon incident, the repeated provocations over Taiwan. So this was the strategy on which President Biden seemed to set the Western world. However, that strategy was upset in two ways. Firstly, voters domestically gave their verdict and they were not in favor of this. When we started 2024, it was supposed to be a year of elections and everybody was looking forward to what would happen and blah, blah, and so on. The fact is that the year of elections has essentially put practically every government that followed Biden's lead in crisis. If you think about it, the moment Trump won the election, the German government fell. A few weeks later, the French government fell. The South Korean government is in crisis. The British government is in no great shape in the sense that it has become the most unpopular government that exists this early in its term, so within 5 or 6 months of being elected, the popular support is lower than ever. So if you think of all the major governments, they are all in crisis. The Japanese government is in crisis. So you see one after another that this is not working. Oh, and Giorgia Meloni may be an exception, but she's an exception not because she's doing well. She's an exception because she was already an exception. She was already one of the few governments that had been elected on a ticket that was already opposed to Biden's style. There were ever greater signs in 2024 that Russia was going to actually win the war on the ground, despite the effort of the Biden administration to keep sending funds. And this Russian victory was becoming so apparent that in the last few months of 2024, it became routine to hear important officials in Western governments, and including the Biden government, essentially saying, giving indications, that basically we cannot continue this war forever. We have to withdraw. And quite frankly, I think that, I was saying in September and October that the Biden administration is only keeping up the appearance of continuing this war until the election. Once the election takes place, even if Kamala Harris wins, they will say, we can't do any more. They just couldn't do it before the election because doing it before the election would have sounded like defeat. So they had to keep up the appearance. So internationally, vis-a-vis Russia, this is not working. And vis-a-vis China, think about all the provocations. I mean, essentially, there have been two categories, military provocations and economic provocations. On military provocations, China has simply and quietly shown its own military prowess in the region. China is not, of course, expansive, but China has shown its commitment to defend all those trade routes, the region itself with the territory that it considers its own from any Western or American aggression. So I would say that China's done very well on that. We've read about all the important advances in military technology that China has undertaken. All of that is fine. Although Chinese growth has slowed compared to the, say, 5-7 years ago, nevertheless, this is still a very good growth compared to the West. Chinese government has shown that it is capable of taking care of whatever local problems there may be, whether it is local government financing or real estate problems or what have you. It has shown it is capable of dealing with that. And most importantly, I would say that it has shown that it is capable, even in this context where the West claims that the Chinese government is in great crisis, of producing a far-reaching vision of this development with high quality productive forces, new quality productive forces, and so on, and projecting a completely new paradigm of what it means for a country to advance. That advance of that country is not supposed to be at the expense of the world, but the advance of that country is supposed to be shared with the world, creating a more stable basis for both China's advance and the advance of the world. So I would say in all of these ways, the Biden strategy has failed. And I'll just add one other thing. We are going through a liminal period, a transitional period between November 5 and the election and January 20 and the inauguration. And I believe that in this period, President Biden has been up to no good. He has, at the very minimum, been trying to present the incoming Trump administration with a number of fait accomplis, a number of situations that he will have to deal with that he cannot easily change, whether it is on Ukraine, on China, on Syria, on Israel, what have you. He has been trying to create this situation. I also wondered if he would try to create a situation, given how unhappy he is about having been forced to withdraw from the presidential campaign. And so Biden, when I say Biden, I mean the whole team. I think the whole team may very well have been trying to create a situation in which there is a war. And then you can say, well, there's a war on. We can't have politics as normal. We can't have an inauguration. Pure and simple.
Right, so I did indicate to you that we had a really packed session for the Thinkers Forum today. So also coming up on this segment, we hear from Larry Johnson, a former CIA intelligence analyst who provides a critical take on US-China relations. So according to Johnson, if you are in China and listening to the rhetoric coming out of Washington, especially during the last 4 years of the Biden administration, you'd hear China being painted as an enemy, an imperialist power, and a threat that the United States must confront and stop. So let's dive into his perspective on this escalating narrative.
If you're sitting in China and listening to what's being said in Washington, D.C., particularly during the last 4 years of the Biden administration, China is being presented as an enemy, an imperialist power, and the United States must stop it. And there's been even talk about going to war with China as soon as this year, 2025. And then when China reacts to that, we go, see, they're a threat. It's like if you threaten that you're going to come kill me and you're going to attack my house and I'm going to go out and buy a gun to protect myself, you can't say, see, he's a danger. No, I'm taking steps to protect myself. So what the United States didn't count on was how strong the relationship has become between Moscow and Beijing, between Russia and China. U.S. policy under Richard Nixon, when it was inaugurated in 1972, was designed to have that opening with China, but for the ulterior motive of splitting China away from Russia. We wanted to keep Russia and China separate. Now Joe Biden, through his crazy policies, have brought China and Russia together. And it's a political alliance, it's an economic alliance, it's a military alliance. It's transformative. And there's still many in the United States that believe that this is not going to last, that this is a bad relationship, and that's just crazy. I think they do not understand it in terms of how I think both Russia and China have had that moment of awakening where prior to February of 2002 or 2022, I think leaders in both China and Russia may have believed that there was a way to negotiate with or to find an accommodation with the United States. I think they now realize that the United States is a threat, a bona fide threat, because the United States keeps talking about China and Russia as imperial powers, but it is the United States that has military bases around the world, not the Chinese, not the Russians. It's the United States that has been involved with invading other countries that don't represent any kind of direct threat to the United States, and then justifying it as a pursued promotion of freedom and democracy. We're the imperialist power, and we refuse to acknowledge it. Instead, we project and pretend that it's the Chinese and the Russians. China's got the greatest industrial capability in the world. That wasn't the case 50 years ago. China may lack sometimes in critical resources, oil and gas in particular. Oh, who has that? Oh, that's Russia. So all of a sudden, there's Russia and China find a way that they, as neighbors, that they can live together, and it's a mutually rewarding relationship. Each benefits from it. There are people in both some of my former CIA colleagues and people who former and current in the Department of Defense and the CIA who really believe that we can somehow deceive Russia into breaking its relationship with China, and that Russia will align with us. The United States is an abusive spouse. Russia is what I would call a battered spouse who is now awakened and said, wait a second, I'm not going to let them beat me up anymore. That is the thing that the United States really always perceives these relationships in terms of who's dominant and who's inferior. But Russia and China have found a way that it's a relationship of equals, and there's a respect that comes, a genuine respect, where you don't have to feel that you compete against one another. That there are things that China has that benefit Russia. There are things that Russia has that benefit China. It's a healthy relationship, and frankly, this is what the United States feared could develop. Well, it's happened, and now the United States doesn't know what to do. Now, along with that are sanctions that the United States keeps imposing on China, and of late, the Chinese have finally said, we've had enough of this. We're going to sanction you back, and imposing sanctions on shipments of antimony, gallium, sanctions specifically on, I believe it was at least 30 companies and or individuals connected with major U.S. industrial military contractors. But up to this point, the United States has thought that it could get away with bullying China. The entire purpose of building intertwined commercial relationships, having the United States and China with investments in each other, is to reduce the prospect of war, where it's too costly. War would be too costly to either side, and so they have to find a way to work together. But we see this fear of China being constantly presented in the U.S. press. Oh, the Chinese are buying up our farmland. Well, when we get Western investors that go into China and try to buy land, if China doesn't do that, they're unfair. I said, so let's come up with a consistent standard. Either we're going to allow foreign companies to invest and own assets in our country, or we're not. And then what's the incentive for that foreign capital to go to that other country when it can be seized, robbed? It's one of those things that, we're going to have to figure out if we're going to be all American or if we're going to have trade with China. The Chinese have a better understanding of themselves and their history. They recognize that China is an ancient society. It's gone through different political formulations and different area groups controlling, etc. That is a cultural reality for the Chinese people. The Americans, so people like me, whose ancestors fought in the American Revolution, we can say, yeah, buddy, 400 years. That's nothing like 5,000 years. So Americans, by and large, have no historical depth and tie, and nothing really to point to. We like to say, oh, we're the greatest society ever. We got the greatest military ever. We're the biggest. They're the best. And we're not. And see, that's why I say this. There's such a disconnect between we were. At one stage, we were. We are no longer. And instead of gracefully admitting that we have been passed by, I mean, some of the, I don't know how many high-speed train systems you have in China, but you don't have just one. The United States doesn't have any. So you've got some genuine, the United States like to maintain, oh, we're the innovators. We do all the innovation. And yet when you go back into our history of who invented which technologies, they're always invented by people that came from other friggin' countries. Nikola Tesla, Italian. Werner von Braun with the rockets and going to the moon, German. The number of China is often criticized here in America as, they're copycats. They're only good at copying what we do. They can't create on their own, which, again, I say is just, it's an arrogance. It's a form of racism. Instead of recognizing, you know what? A society, a culture, a people that have endured for over 5,000 years, maybe they're worth listening to and paying attention to and finding a way to get along. China is not trying to invade the state of Washington or Oregon or California. It's not launching flotillas of naval ships loaded with Chinese soldiers that want to storm the beaches. If we can find a way where we don't have to live in this zero-sum game law of the jungle, and I think that's one of the things that we're seeing now being demonstrated by the relationship between Russia and China, how Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping treat each other, the kind of mutual respect that's exhibited, and it's not a false respect; it's a genuine respect. That I take that as providing hope for the future.
And that wraps up this edition of China Now, your weekly guide to understanding China and its place in today's world. My name is Makiza Latifa, and I'm happy you made time to join us. From the latest news on China currents to thought-provoking insights from our Thinkers Forum, we hope you're leaving with a deeper perspective on the forces shaping our global future. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you same time next week for more analysis, ideas, and stories from the heart of China to the world stage. Until then, take care and enjoy the rest of our programs.